August 15, 1945. Final Command Post, Oita Naval Air Base, Southern Japan. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki stood before 11 young pilots, their faces still bearing the softness of youth despite months of war. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had ended moments ago. Japan had lost. Ugaki already knew what he would do next. He had known since June 1942, the day his commander and closest friend predicted this exact moment while standing on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, watching 4 Japanese carriers burn at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto had turned to him then and said words Ugaki recorded in his diary that night, "Write this down carefully, my friend. In 3 years, perhaps less, Japan will surrender unconditionally. When that day comes, some of us will feel obligated to follow our men into death. But I want you to remember, our deaths will change nothing. Mathematics has already written the ending." 3 years and 2 months later, Ugaki understood. But understanding didn't change duty. Matome Ugaki was born January 15, 1890, in Okayama Prefecture, son of a Buddhist priest who taught him that truth exists independent of desire. This philosophical foundation would torment him for 5 years as he served beside a commander who saw the future with perfect clarity while Ugaki desperately wanted to believe otherwise. He entered the Naval Academy in 1908, graduating 8th in his class, high enough for respect, not so high as to breed arrogance. This middle position would define his career, close enough to power to witness everything, distant enough from supreme command to avoid responsibility for the catastrophe he helped orchestrate. Their partnership began in November 1941, when Ugaki was assigned as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet. His new commander was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, already famous within naval circles for his pessimism about war with America. Their first private meeting occurred November 18 aboard the battleship Nagato in Hiroshima Bay. Ugaki arrived expecting strategic discussion. Instead, Yamamoto handed him a notebook filled with calculations, production statistics, and oil consumption projections. "Read this tonight," Yamamoto said. "Then tell me honestly if you believe Japan can win a war with the United States. Not what you hope. What the mathematics tells you." Ugaki spent that night in his cabin studying numbers that seemed impossible. American steel production exceeded Japan's by 12 to 1. Oil production, 500 to 1. Automobile manufacturing demonstrated mass production capability Japan couldn't imagine matching. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion: inevitable defeat. The only variable was time. He returned the next morning determined to find flaws in the analysis, some factor Yamamoto had missed that would permit hope. For 2 hours they reviewed every assumption, every projection, every statistical foundation. Ugaki deployed every argument he'd prepared: Japanese fighting spirit, warrior tradition, tactical superiority, defensive advantages. Yamamoto listened patiently, then methodically dismantled each argument with more numbers, more evidence, more mathematics. "I spent years in America," Yamamoto explained, "studying their factories, their oil fields, their production systems. I hitchhiked across Texas counting oil derricks. I stood inside Ford's River Rouge plant watching them produce more steel in a day than we produce in a week. I visited shipyards that could build carriers faster than we can design them. These aren't estimates, Ugaki-san. These are observations. Mathematics doesn't care about warrior spirit." That conversation transformed Ugaki's worldview and cursed him with knowledge he couldn't escape. He would spend the next 3.5 years simultaneously planning operations and calculating their ultimate futility, watching Yamamoto's prophecies fulfill themselves with calendar precision while hoping desperately that somehow the mathematics would be wrong. December 7, 1941. Ugaki stood beside Yamamoto on Nagato's bridge, awaiting reports from Pearl Harbor. The attack succeeded beyond expectations: 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft eliminated, minimal Japanese losses. Around them, staff officers celebrated with barely contained joy. Japan had struck the first blow. The Americans were crippled. Surely they would sue for peace rather than endure a long Pacific War. Ugaki felt the infectious enthusiasm spreading through the ship, until he glanced at Yamamoto. The admiral stood motionless, face expressionless, hands clasped behind his back. As staff officers broke out sake to celebrate, Yamamoto simply walked to his cabin without a word. Ugaki followed, finding him at his desk, staring at a map of the Pacific. "Should I offer congratulations, Admiral?" Ugaki asked. Yamamoto didn't look up. "Save your congratulations for when we see what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Not because we attacked, but because we attacked without warning. The embassy in Washington bungled the declaration. The Americans think we are dishonorable. They will never negotiate now." Ugaki tried optimism. "But surely our victories in the coming months, 6 months, Yamamoto interrupted. "Perhaps 1 year. That's what I promised the Prime Minister. That's exactly what we'll have before American production overwhelms us." He pulled out a sheet with calculations. "I have computed when their war production will reach full mobilization, July 1942. I have computed when their new carriers will be commissioned, late 1942 and throughout 1943. I have computed when their oil production will exceed our total consumption, it already does. The mathematics is elegant, Ugaki-san. And it's pitiless." That night, Ugaki began his war diary, 5 years of entries documenting the slow-motion catastrophe of watching prophecy become history. December 8th entry, "The Admiral shows no joy in our greatest victory. He understands something I am only beginning to grasp: we have won a battle and lost a war in the same morning." For 6 months, Japan ran wild exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Ugaki coordinated operations across the Pacific. The Philippines fell, Singapore fell, the Dutch East Indies fell. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from India's borders to the Central Pacific. Each victory felt hollow to Ugaki because Yamamoto's reactions never changed. After Singapore's surrender, Yamamoto's only comment, "Now we must defend everything with resources adequate for nothing." After capturing Dutch East Indies oil fields, his response, "We've secured 6% of American production. They'll barely notice it missing." The staff officers who celebrated each victory increasingly avoided Yamamoto's presence. His pessimism felt like betrayal to men raised on warrior virtues. But Ugaki couldn't avoid him. As chief of staff, he spent hours daily with the admiral, receiving tutorials in the mathematics of doom. Yamamoto showed him production reports from American factories. Ford's Willow Run plant was being constructed to produce B-24 bombers at 1 per hour. 1 hour, Ugaki-san. We're celebrating capturing airfields while they build entire air forces every few days. He showed shipping construction projections. American yards would launch more tonnage in 1943 than Japan's entire merchant fleet. Every ship we sink, they replace with 3. We're fighting arithmetic. He showed oil consumption calculations. The combined fleet burned more fuel in one major operation than Japanese refineries could replace in a month. We're drinking our strategic reserve. Within 18 months, our ships will sit in port for lack of fuel while American task forces roam freely. Every projection pointed toward summer 1942 as the turning point. American production would reach critical mass. Their intelligence capabilities would improve. Their command would learn from early mistakes. And somewhere in the Pacific, they would strike back with overwhelming force. Yamamoto predicted the battle would occur at Midway, Japan's most exposed outpost. He even predicted the approximate date, early June, when American carriers would be repaired and ready. Ugaki desperately wanted him to be wrong. June 4, 1942. Ugaki stood beside Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier strike force approaching Midway. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex: a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, a carrier strike on Midway, then decisive battle when the American fleet responded. It relied on American ignorance of Japanese positions and American inferiority in carrier strength. Neither assumption proved true. The first report arrived at 10:30 a.m., American dive bombers attacking the carrier force. Then silence. Excruciating, endless silence. Ugaki watched Yamamoto's face for reaction. The admiral stood motionless, as if waiting for confirmation of something already known. At 11:45 a.m., the reports came cascading: Akagi hit, massive fires. Kaga hit, abandoning ship. Sorya hit, sinking. Within minutes, 3 fleet carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, irreplaceable platforms representing years of construction and decades of pilot training, were burning wrecks. Hiryu counterattacked and damaged the American carrier Yorktown, but by evening she too was hit and sinking. 4 carriers lost in one day. The decisive battle Japan needed had occurred, and Japan had lost decisively. Staff officers stood paralyzed, unable to process the magnitude of catastrophe. Ugaki felt reality fracturing around him. 6 months ago they'd been unstoppable. Now their carrier force was shattered. Yamamoto simply nodded once, as if checking an item off a list. He turned to Ugaki and spoke quietly, intending the words for him alone. It's June 4th, Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 6 months exactly. I promised them 6 months to a year of victories. They got exactly 6 months, to the day. That evening, after ordering the fleet to withdraw, Yamamoto made one of his rare addresses to senior staff. His words, transcribed in Ugaki's diary, were characteristically precise: the American giant is now fully awake. From this moment, we fight only to delay the inevitable. Our task is no longer victory, mathematics has already determined the outcome. Our task is to fight with sufficient honor that our nation can negotiate acceptable surrender terms. Judge me not by the defeats to come, but by whether we preserve enough of Japan to rebuild after the war we've already lost. Ugaki began that night to truly understand the burden Yamamoto carried. He wasn't just commanding a fleet, he was managing a calculated defeat, trying to minimize casualties while maintaining morale among men who believed they were fighting for victory. It was perhaps the most difficult leadership challenge imaginable, conducting war knowing every casualty died in a cause already lost. The months after Midway validated every projection Yamamoto had made. Ugaki watched the predictions fulfill themselves like mathematical proofs. American production reached levels that seemed impossible even given Yamamoto's warnings. By early 1943, American shipyards were launching 1 aircraft carrier every month, 1 destroyer every week, 1 merchant ship every day. Their factories produced 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. Ugaki computed the numbers himself, refusing to believe until he verified independently. It was true. All of it. Meanwhile, Japanese production peaked and began declining. Lack of resources, lack of industrial capacity, and increasingly, lack of shipping to transport materials as American submarines strangled supply lines. The oil situation deteriorated exactly as Yamamoto had calculated. By mid-1943, tanker losses meant Japanese refineries received less than half their required crude oil. The combined fleet's fuel reserves dwindled monthly. Major operations required draining reserve stocks that couldn't be replaced. Ugaki recorded the bitter irony: Japan had conquered the Dutch East Indies oil fields but couldn't transport the oil back to Japan. The Americans seemed to know everything. Their submarines appeared exactly where convoys would pass. Their aircraft struck at vulnerable moments. Their intelligence was either phenomenally lucky or they'd broken Japanese codes. Yamamoto suspected the latter. We talk too much, he told Ugaki. We broadcast our plans thinking codes provide security. But codes are mathematics, and Americans excel at mathematics. Assume they read everything. Ugaki noticed Yamamoto taking increased risks, exposing himself to danger unnecessarily. In March 1943, the admiral insisted on personally inspecting forward bases in the Solomon Islands despite the risk. When Ugaki protested, Yamamoto's response was uncharacteristically emotional. "I've commanded men into battles I knew we'd lose. I've sent pilots to die in a war I knew was unwinnable. Don't lecture me about risk, my friend. If American fighters find my plane, perhaps that's the honorable end I've earned." The inspection tour was scheduled for April 18, 1943. Ugaki insisted on accompanying him despite Yamamoto's objections. 2 medium bombers would make the flight, Yamamoto in one, Ugaki and other staff officers in another. April 18, 1943, 9:34 a.m. Ugaki's bomber flew 500 feet above the jungle canopy approaching Bougainville. His plane was slightly behind and above Yamamoto's, giving him clear view of what happened next. American P-38 fighters appeared as if materialized from nothing, perfectly positioned, perfectly timed. They'd been waiting. Ugaki watched helplessly as tracers converged on Yamamoto's plane. The bomber's wing shattered. The aircraft rolled, dove, and disappeared into the jungle canopy. Within seconds, the P-38s turned on Ugaki's plane. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. The bomber crashed into the ocean. Ugaki regained consciousness in the water, uniform shredded, bleeding from multiple wounds. Rescuers pulled him from the sea barely alive. He learned days later that Yamamoto's body had been found in the jungle wreckage, still strapped to his seat, hand on his sword. The man who'd calculated the fleet's defeat with perfect accuracy had been killed by American fighters guided by intelligence so precise it seemed impossible without broken codes, exactly as he'd predicted. Recovering from his wounds, Ugaki faced a crisis of purpose. Yamamoto had made him custodian of terrible knowledge, the certainty of Japan's defeat. What was his obligation now? Continue the war he knew was lost. Seek peace. Commit suicide to follow his commander. He found his answer in Yamamoto's final words to him before the flight: "If I'm killed, you must survive, Ugaki-san." Someone needs to witness what happens when nations ignore mathematics. Someone needs to remember that this catastrophe was predicted, calculable, and entirely preventable. Bear that burden. Bear witness. So Ugaki continued serving, accepting command positions he didn't want, planning operations he knew were futile, watching the mathematically inevitable grind forward. In October 1944, he was given command of battleship divisions for the operation at Leyte Gulf, Japan's last major fleet action. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944, was desperation calcified into strategy. American forces had landed in the Philippines. The combined fleet, starved of fuel and pilots, would make one final sortie, stake everything on destroying the landing fleet. Ugaki commanded the center force built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful warships ever built, now reduced to floating fuel dumps struggling to reach the battle. The mathematics was absurd. They were committing the world's largest battleships to attack an enemy with overwhelming air superiority, total intelligence advantage, and unlimited fuel. It was suicide disguised as strategy. Yamamoto would have refused the operation. But Yamamoto was dead. On October 24, American carrier aircraft swarmed Musashi. Ugaki watched from Yamato's bridge as more than 300 aircraft attacked in waves. Musashi absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before capsizing, the strongest ship ever built overwhelmed by sheer volume of aerial assault. They hadn't even reached the landing beaches yet. The surviving ships pressed forward through the night. At dawn October 25, they were positioned perfectly to destroy the vulnerable escort carriers protecting the landing force. Victory seemed possible. Then the fleet commander, Admiral Kurita, inexplicably ordered retreat. They'd come within miles of their objective, sacrificed Musashi and thousands of men, and withdrew without accomplishing anything. Ugaki's frustration erupted. He demanded explanation. Kurita, exhausted and shell-shocked, could only say he believed they were facing the main American carrier fleet and would be annihilated. In his diary that night, Ugaki wrote, "We have become a fleet afraid of battle because we know battles are fatal. Yamamoto understood this would happen. An inferior force cannot afford engagement, but a fleet that cannot engage has no purpose. We have become mathematical abstractions, forces that exist on paper but cannot accept the casualties that action requires. We lost this battle in 1941 when we started a war the mathematics condemned. After Leyte Gulf, there was no combined fleet. Fuel shortages kept surviving ships in port. Pilot attrition meant carriers floated as empty decks. The defensive perimeter contracted monthly as American forces advanced. Ugaki was reassigned to command 5th Air Fleet in southern Japan, the kamikaze forces. He'd fallen from commanding battleships to overseeing suicide attacks by teenagers in obsolete aircraft. The decay seemed symbolic. August 1945 brought the mathematical end state Yamamoto had predicted. Ugaki watched from Oita Air Base as American B-29s burned Japanese cities with impunity. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed more than the atomic bombs would. Then came Hiroshima, August 6. The single bomb Ugaki had been told would require an entire squadron's payload. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The Americans had industrialized even apocalypse. Their production capability extended to weapons that erased cities. On August 15, the Emperor's surrender broadcast played at noon. Japan had lost. Ugaki felt strange relief beneath the grief. Finally, the mathematics had completed. The future Yamamoto had calculated with painful precision in 1941 had arrived. Every projection validated. Every warning vindicated. Ugaki survived to witness the end his commander knew was inevitable. But he also felt obligation. Yamamoto was dead. The junior officers who'd served loyally were dead. Thousands of pilots he'd sent on kamikaze missions were dead. How could he, who'd helped plan the losing war, survive when they had not? That afternoon, he announced he would lead one final kamikaze mission against American ships at Okinawa. His subordinates protested. The war was over, the Emperor had ordered surrender. I obey the Emperor's command to surrender, Ugaki replied. But I also honor obligation to those who died under my command. This isn't defiance. It's accounting. He selected 11 volunteers from the remaining pilots. At 4 p.m., they took off in 5 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. Ugaki carried Yamamoto's personal sword, given to him by the Admiral's family. Hours later, American radar detected aircraft approaching Okinawa. Fighters intercepted and destroyed them far from any targets. None of the pilots survived. Ugaki's body was never recovered. His final diary entry, written that morning, contained no apology and no regret, only acknowledgement. Yamamoto told me that mathematics had written the ending, and our deaths would change nothing. He was correct. My death today is theater, not strategy. But some theater is necessary for a warrior's soul, even when his mind knows better. I die not believing it matters, but believing it must be done. This is the contradiction of duty. American occupation forces later discovered Ugaki's war diaries, 5 years of entries documenting history's most precisely predicted defeat. His records proved Yamamoto had foreseen everything, the 6-month timeline, the production disparity, the inevitable surrender, even the approximate date. Every warning had been accurate. Every calculation validated. The mathematical prophecy had been perfect. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki's tragedy wasn't dying, it was bearing witness. He stood beside history's most accurate strategic prophet and watched Japan ignore warnings that would have prevented catastrophe. He witnessed the mathematics of modern industrial warfare play out exactly as calculated, and he couldn't change the outcome any more than he could repeal physical laws. His story illustrates the burden of knowledge without authority, seeing clearly while powerless to alter course. Post-war analysis showed Yamamoto's projections had been remarkably precise. His estimates of American production were within 10% of actual wartime output. His timeline of 6 months to 1 year of Japanese victories ended exactly at Midway, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prediction of inevitable defeat came true 3 years later. His assessment that fighting would continue until unconditional surrender despite the mathematical certainty of loss, all accurate. Ugaki's diaries provided evidence that Japan's leadership had been warned repeatedly and explicitly by their most qualified expert. They chose war anyway, preferring comfortable illusions to uncomfortable mathematics. The consequences were precisely what Yamamoto calculated: 3.5 years of futile bloodshed ending in unconditional surrender, atomic devastation, and foreign occupation. The story of Yamamoto and Ugaki poses uncomfortable questions about institutional decision-making. What happens when the most knowledgeable expert is ignored? When mathematics is dismissed as defeatism? When truth-telling becomes dangerous? The answers wrote themselves in fire across the Pacific. Perhaps Ugaki's most important contribution was his documentation. His diaries ensured Yamamoto's warnings were preserved for history. Future generations could study how a nation talked itself into mathematically unwinnable war despite explicit, accurate warnings from unimpeachable sources. His witness testimony convicted an entire leadership system of willful blindness. In his final entry, Ugaki included words intended for future readers: "We were told the truth. We knew the mathematics. We understood industrial reality. We chose war anyway because we preferred dying with honor to living with humiliation." Yamamoto tried to show us this was false choice, that there was honor in accepting reality and crafting strategy within actual constraints. We called him defeatist and made him command our defeat. Learn from this. Truth is not defeatism. Mathematics is not cowardice. And prophecy ignored becomes tragedy fulfilled. Admiral Yamamoto spent years in America and warned Japan would lose in 6 months. Vice Admiral Ugaki spent years beside Yamamoto and watched every warning come true, exactly on schedule, precisely as calculated. Both men died in service to the nation they tried desperately to save from itself. Mathematics does not compromise. Reality does not negotiate. And prophecy, once fulfilled, provides no satisfaction to the prophet, only the cold comfort of having been correct when being wrong would have been infinitely preferable.